The wedding of the year in Savannah shimmered beneath a late afternoon sun that turned the Spanish moss into strands of silver. White roses framed the aisle, and crystal lanterns swayed gently in the breeze drifting from the river. Guests filled the manicured garden behind the Harper estate, their voices soft with admiration for the decor, the music, and the groom. Daniel Reed stood at the altar in a tailored charcoal suit, smiling with effortless confidence. He had the kind of presence that reassured investors and charmed strangers within seconds. To most of the town, he was a success story. Emily Harper floated down the aisle, her dress catching the light, her eyes fixed on Daniel. She looked certain, hopeful, and deeply in love. Every detail had been curated for perfection. Even the string quartet played a delicate arrangement that made several guests dab at their eyes. In the third row sat Margaret Harper, rigid in her seat. Her silk shawl had slipped from one shoulder, but she didn't notice. Her gaze never left Daniel. She watched the way his smile tightened whenever Emily's back was turned, the way his fingers flexed at his sides. No one else saw it. They saw only the polished exterior. Margaret's reputation had been slipping for months. After her husband's death, she had begun attending events with a glass of wine in hand. Sometimes, two. Sometimes she let her grief show too openly. Whispers followed her at charity dinners and church gatherings. Daniel had been especially patient with her, gently guiding her away from conversations, offering to drive her home. "She's had a rough year," he would say sympathetically. The town admired him for it. But Margaret had noticed something beneath that patience. A calculación. A watchfulness. As the officiant began the vows, Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she was certain those around her could hear it. She remembered another ceremony 2 years earlier, smaller, quieter, when Daniel had married Olivia Reed. Margaret had attended out of courtesy. Olivia had seemed nervous that day, her smile slightly strained. Months later, Olivia was dead. Her fall down the staircase of their historic townhouse near Forsyth Park ruled a tragic accident. Margaret had tried to accept it. Everyone had. Daniel had wept convincingly at the funeral. He had spoken about loss and fate and how quickly life can change. But Margaret remembered something else. Faint bruises around Olivia's wrists at a spring gala, carefully concealed with bracelets. She remembered Olivia gripping her hand too tightly and whispering, "If anything ever happens to me, don't trust him." At the time, Margaret had dismissed it as marital stress. Now, as she watched Daniel take Emily's hands, the memory burned. "Speak now or forever hold your peace," the officiant said. The words seemed to echo unnaturally. Margaret stood. Her chair scraped sharply against the stone patio. Conversations froze. The quartet faltered. "Stop this wedding," she said, her voice trembling but loud. A ripple of shock moved through the guests. Someone muttered, "Oh no." Another whispered, "Has she been drinking?" Emily's face drained of color. "Mom, please." Margaret pointed directly at Daniel. "He killed his first wife." The silence that followed felt endless. Daniel blinked once, then exhaled slowly, as though absorbing a painful misunderstanding. "Margaret," he said gently, stepping forward, "that's a terrible thing to say. I know this day is emotional for you." His tone was calm, too calm. "She didn't fall," Margaret insisted. "She was afraid of you." Gasps spread across the garden. A groomsman stepped closer, ready to intervene. 2 guests exchanged knowing looks, the kind reserved for public embarrassment. Emily shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You're not thinking clearly." Margaret's hands trembled, but her gaze never left Daniel's. For the briefest second, his composure cracked. Something cold flickered there. Not anger, fear. That flicker told her everything. Within moments, Margaret was guided away from the aisle. She did not resist. She did not shout again. As she passed Daniel, she noticed his jaw tighten. She leaned closer and whispered, "I remember what she told me." His eyes darkened. Outside the gates, the murmurs intensified. Poor Emily. This is humiliating. Margaret needs help. The narrative had already formed. Grieving widow, unstable mother, too much wine. Inside, the ceremony resumed after a strained delay. Daniel reassured the guests with a soft speech about forgiveness and compassion. Many applauded. Some even praised his patience. But one guest had not applauded. Detective Carla Ruiz, a distant cousin invited more out of politeness than closeness, had watched Daniel carefully. She had seen suspects maintain composure before. She had studied micro-expressions during interrogations. Daniel had not looked outraged. He had looked threatened. As Margaret sat alone in her car outside the estate, her reflection stared back at her in the rearview mirror. She let her shoulders slump, let the image of a humiliated, unstable woman settle over her like a costume. They could call her crazy, they could call her drunk. What they didn't know was that she had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she wasn't finished. The investigation into Olivia Reed's death had ended quietly 2 years earlier. Filed away as a tragic domestic accident. She had supposedly slipped while descending the narrow staircase of the townhouse she shared with Daniel, striking her head fatally. The home, a restored 19th-century property near Forsyth Park, had steep wooden steps and polished banisters. The explanation had seemed plausible. Margaret remembered standing in that foyer days after Olivia's death. The house smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. Daniel had insisted on showing mourners where it happened. "Right here," he had said softly, pointing to the bottom of the stairs. His voice had cracked convincingly. He had described finding her, calling for help, kneeling beside her. But Margaret's eyes had drifted upward along the staircase. The railing had been smooth and sturdy, the steps narrow but even. She had imagined Olivia tumbling alone, and something about it felt wrong. At the funeral, the casket had been closed. Daniel said the head injury had been severe. Guests nodded sympathetically. Margaret, however, remembered the charity gala months before. Olivia had worn long sleeves despite the heat. When she reached for a champagne flute, her bracelet had shifted, revealing faint bruises around her wrist. Margaret had caught her gaze. "Are you all right?" she had asked quietly. Olivia had hesitated too long. "Of course," she had replied, but her smile had faltered. Later that evening, away from the crowd, Olivia's composure cracked. "Daniel just gets angry sometimes," she had murmured. "He doesn't mean it." Margaret had advised patience, counseling, communication, the standard reassurances. She regretted those words now. After Olivia's death, Daniel had become the picture of a grieving widower. He attended community events, donated generously, and spoke about honoring Olivia's memory. Within a year, he was courting Emily. The town viewed it as a sign he was healing.